The silence inside the mansion didn't just feel heavy, it felt like the calm before a financial apocalypse. Papers were scattered across the marble floor, a shattered glass lay near the staircase, and standing in the center of it all was Kirk Frost, completely frozen. Because just minutes earlier, everything he thought he owned, his empire, his pride, his control, had been ripped away in one brutal courtroom decision. $300 million. That number echoed like a gunshot. And the one walking away with it? None other than Rasheeda, his wife, his business partner, and now, the woman who just shattered his entire world. Sources say Kirk didn't just lose money, he lost everything. You think you can play me for years and walk away untouched? Rasheeda allegedly snapped in court, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. No, this ends today. Fans are shocked. Social media is exploding. And behind closed doors? Emotions ran high as friends and family scrambled to pick sides. Because what looked like a power couple on the outside was secretly a ticking time bomb. Cheating rumors, hidden accounts, secret deals, and now, a legal war that has left the Frost family completely divided. Witnesses claim Kirk's face went pale as the judge read the final ruling. One insider whispered, he didn't just lose the case, he broke in that moment. But here's where it gets even messier. Because Rasheeda isn't just walking away rich, she's walking away with receipts. And what she's planning to reveal next? That might destroy Kirk Frost for good. Kirk Frost stood there staring at the court papers like they were written in a language he no longer understood, his hands slightly shaking, his jaw tight, but his eyes telling a completely different story. This was not just anger, this was panic, the kind of panic a man feels when everything he carefully built starts collapsing right in front of him and across the room. Rasheeda didn't even flinch. She sat calm, composed, legs crossed, like she had been waiting for this exact moment for years, and when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the entire room. You thought I wouldn't find out, Kirk, you really thought you could play me and still win. Her words cut deep, and Kirk immediately snapped back. This ain't what you think, Rash, you blowing this out of proportion. But even as he said it, his voice cracked just enough for everyone to notice. Fans are shocked because this was the same couple who once bragged about being unbreakable, the same duo that turned their relationship into a brand, into a business, into an image that millions believed in, but behind that image was something far darker, something hidden, and now it was all coming out one by one like dominoes, falling too fast to stop. Insiders claim this wasn't a sudden explosion, this was a slow burn, a buildup of secrets, lies, and quiet betrayals that Rasheeda had been collecting silently while Kirk thought he was still in control. Emotions ran high as whispers filled the courtroom, people leaning toward each other saying this about to get ugly, and it did, because Rasheeda didn't just come with accusations, she came with receipts, bank statements, hidden transactions, messages that painted a completely different picture of the man Kirk Frost thought he could be in public and the man he really was behind closed doors. You moved money, Kirk, she said, sliding documents across the table. You hid assets, you thought I wouldn't notice, but I see everything now. Kirk's face tightened, his confidence slipping second by second. That's business, Rash, you don't understand how this works, he fired back, but she leaned forward, eyes locked on his, and said, no, Kirk, you don't understand how this works anymore, because this time I'm not the one being played. And that's when the tension shifted completely, because for the first time Kirk realized this wasn't just another argument, this wasn't something he could talk his way out of, this was real, this was final. The family was left divided as news started spreading outside the courtroom, friends picking sides, some defending Kirk, saying he always handled the business, others standing firmly with Rasheeda, saying she deserved better after everything she endured for years. Social media erupted within minutes, fans posting reactions, calling it karma, calling it justice, calling it the end of an era. And still inside that courtroom, the real battle was just beginning. Kirk ran his hand over his face, trying to regain control, trying to find some angle, some way to flip the situation, but Rasheeda wasn't giving him that chance. You had years to fix this, she said quietly, years to be honest, and you chose not to, so now we're here. And when the judge finally began reviewing the evidence, the room fell into a silence so thick it felt suffocating, every second dragging, every breath heavy. Kirk's lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgent, but Kirk barely responded, his focus locked on Rasheeda, who didn't look away, not once. This wasn't just about money anymore, this was about power, respect, and everything that had been taken from her behind the scenes. And now the truth was being dragged into the light, whether Kirk was ready or not. And when the judge spoke again, asking Kirk directly about the hidden accounts, there was a pause, a long dangerous pause that said more than words ever could. I don't recall, Kirk finally muttered, but that answer only made things worse, because Rasheeda let out a small laugh, not of humor but of disbelief. You don't recall, she repeated. You don't recall moving millions, Kirk. That single moment shifted everything, the energy, the perception, the outcome, because now it wasn't just suspicion, it was exposure, and Kirk knew it. His shoulders dropped slightly, his usual confidence fading into something much more fragile, something much more real. And as more evidence was presented, the courtroom began to feel less like a place of judgment and more like a stage where years of deception were finally being performed in full view. And Kirk Frost, the man who once controlled the narrative, was now losing it piece by piece, while Rasheeda sat there watching it all unfold like she had already accepted the ending long before anyone else realized the story had even changed. And just when Kirk thought it couldn't get worse, Rasheeda leaned back and said, this is only the beginning. That single sentence hung in the air like a storm warning, and Kirk felt it deep because he knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't just about what had already been revealed, this was about everything he thought was still hidden, everything he assumed would never see daylight, and suddenly the confidence he walked in with completely vanished. His lawyer quickly shuffled papers, trying to regain some kind of control, but the damage was already done. Rasheeda didn't rush, she didn't need to, she had time on her side, and more importantly, she had truth, or at least a version of it strong enough to break Kirk down piece by piece. You see, fans are shocked not just because of the money, not just because of the verdict looming over them, but because of how calculated Rasheeda appeared in that moment. This wasn't emotional chaos, this was strategy, this was years of silence turning into one carefully executed move. Emotions ran high as one of Kirk's close friends sitting in the back reportedly whispered, "This man is finished," and honestly it started to look that way, because every time Kirk tried to defend himself, Rasheeda had something ready, something sharper, something impossible to ignore. "Remember when you said everything was transparent?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting, and Kirk immediately looked away. That moment alone spoke volumes, because the family was left divided, watching from different corners, some shaking their heads, some refusing to even make eye contact with Kirk, while others still held on to hope that somehow this could be flipped. But Rasheeda wasn't leaving any room for that hope. "You lied to me," she continued, not raising her voice but letting the weight of those words do all the work. "You lied about the businesses, you lied about the money, and worst of all, you lied about us." Kirk finally snapped back, his frustration boiling over. "You think you perfect, Rash, you think you ain't made mistakes too?" But she didn't react the way he expected. No shouting, no anger, just a slow shake of her head and a quiet response, "I never betrayed you like this." And that silence that followed was louder than any argument, because deep down Kirk knew he had no real comeback for that. And as the judge called for a short recess, the tension didn't ease, it actually grew heavier. Kirk walked out of the courtroom faster than anyone expected, clearly trying to escape the pressure, but outside wasn't any better. Cameras, flashes, whispers, reporters already waiting, because news had spread fast. "Fans are shocked" became more than just a phrase, it became a reality as headlines started forming in real time claiming Kirk Frost on the brink of collapse. Rasheeda exposes everything, and inside a nearby private room Kirk finally let his guard down, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "This ain't right," he muttered under his breath. "This ain't supposed to go like this." His lawyer tried to calm him down, telling him they could still negotiate, still fight back, but Kirk wasn't listening, not fully, because in his mind he was already losing. And back in the courtroom, Rasheeda remained seated, completely unbothered, as if she had already played this entire situation out in her head 100 times before. Today, one of her close friends leaned in, whispering, "You good?" and she simply nodded, because she wasn't just good, she was ready for whatever came next, ready for whatever Kirk still thought he could hide. And when the session resumed, the atmosphere shifted again, because now it wasn't just about finances, it became personal, real personal. New documents were introduced, messages, conversations, timestamps that painted a picture Kirk couldn't talk his way out of. "You told her you were single," Rasheeda said, reading directly from one of the messages, and that's when the entire room reacted, because this wasn't just about money anymore, this was about betrayal on a level Kirk couldn't spin. Fans are shocked because the image they had held onto for so long was breaking apart right in front of them, piece by piece, and Kirk looked completely caught off guard. "Where you even get that from?" he demanded, his voice rising. But Rasheeda didn't hesitate. "From you," she replied, holding up the evidence like it was the final nail. And at that moment emotions ran high like never before, because Kirk's anger turned into desperation, and desperation is loud, it's messy, it's impossible to hide. "You digging through everything now?" he shouted. "You really trying to destroy me?" But Rasheeda stood up, slowly facing him directly, and said, "No, Kirk, you destroyed yourself. I'm just done covering for you." And that line hit harder than anything else said that day, because it exposed not just the situation but the years behind it, the sacrifices, the silence, the things Rasheeda endured while Kirk moved like he was untouchable. And now all of it was catching up at once. The judge called for order, but the tension didn't disappear, it just settled into something colder, something final. As the proceedings continued, more details surfaced, hidden investments, properties under different names, accounts that didn't align with what Kirk had previously claimed, and each new revelation felt like another piece of control slipping out of his hands. The family was left divided even more now, because this wasn't something you could ignore anymore, this wasn't rumor, this was documentation. And Kirk's reactions only made it worse, his pauses, his deflections, his visible frustration, it all painted a picture he couldn't erase. And Rasheeda stayed consistent, calm, direct, unshaken, like she had already emotionally detached from the situation long before this moment even arrived. And then came the turning point, the moment insiders later described as the exact second Kirk Frost lost everything, because Rasheeda's lawyer introduced one final piece of evidence, something nobody in that room expected, something that made even the judge pause before speaking. Kirk's expression changed instantly, his eyes widening, his body stiffening, because whatever that document contained, it wasn't something he was prepared to face. And Rasheeda didn't even look at him this time, she kept her eyes forward, letting the silence build, letting the weight of that moment sink into everyone watching. And when the judge finally asked Kirk to explain what they were seeing, there was no immediate response, no quick excuse, no confident denial, just silence. And that silence said everything. Fans are shocked because they watched a man go from controlled to completely cornered in a matter of minutes, and the energy in that courtroom shifted from tense to undeniable. Kirk Frost was no longer in control of anything, and as whispers filled the room again, one phrase kept repeating, "This is over." But what nobody expected, what nobody saw coming was what Rasheeda said next, because just when it seemed like she had already revealed everything, she leaned forward slightly and said, "You still haven't told them about the other account," and that's when Kirk's entire world seemed to stop again. And the moment those words left her mouth, the entire courtroom froze like time itself had hit pause, because whatever control Kirk thought he still had was gone. In an instant his eyes darted toward his lawyer, then back to Rasheeda, but she didn't even look at him this time. She just sat there calm, almost cold, like she had finally reached the point where nothing he said or did could affect her anymore, and that terrified him more than anything else. "You don't know what you're talking about," Kirk said quickly, but the speed of his response only made it worse because it sounded rehearsed, desperate, like a man trying to plug a leak in a sinking ship with his bare hands. Rasheeda let out a slow breath, then finally turned her head slightly. "You sure about that, Kirk?" she asked quietly, and that quiet tone somehow hit harder than all the shouting before it, because now it wasn't anger, it was certainty, and fans are shocked watching this unfold, because what they thought was already the peak of the drama suddenly felt like just the beginning. Emotions ran high as the judge leaned forward, clearly sensing that whatever was about to come next would change everything again, and Rasheeda's lawyer didn't hesitate, presenting another set of documents, sliding them across like pieces in a game that had already been won, and Kirk's hands didn't even move toward them this time. He just stared, because deep down he already knew what they were. "You hiding money overseas now?" the lawyer asked directly, and that's when the whispers in the courtroom exploded, because this wasn't just messy, this was big. This was the kind of revelation that doesn't just break a relationship, it destroys reputations, it rewrites legacies. Kirk finally grabbed the papers, scanning them quickly, but his expression said it all. This wasn't something he could deny easily, this wasn't something he could explain away as business misunderstanding or confusion. This was intentional, and everyone could see it. "You went through all this just to bring me down," he said under his breath, but Rasheeda shook her head again, still composed, still in control. "No, Kirk, I went through all this because you thought I was stupid," and that line hit like a final verdict before the actual verdict even came. The family was left divided beyond repair now, because even those who once defended Kirk started to shift uncomfortably in their seats, realizing this situation had gone far beyond anything they imagined, and outside the courtroom fans were losing their minds. Social media flooded with reactions, people picking sides, debates turning into full-blown arguments, because nobody could agree on how something that once looked so solid had fallen apart so completely. But inside that room there was no debate, there was only reality, and that reality was closing in on Kirk Frost fast. His lawyer attempted to step in, trying to redirect the conversation, suggesting the evidence needed further verification, but the judge wasn't having it. Not this time, not after everything already presented. The pattern was too clear, the inconsistencies too obvious, and Kirk's own reactions too telling. Emotions ran high as Kirk suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is crazy," he said, raising his voice. "You all acting like I'm some kind of criminal." But no one responded immediately, because the truth didn't need a response anymore, it was sitting right there in black and white. And Rasheeda finally stood as well, not aggressively, not dramatically, just firmly, like someone who had made peace with everything that was happening. "You made your choices, Kirk," she said, looking directly at him, "and now you gotta live with them," and that was it. No yelling, no insults, just finality, and somehow that made it even more powerful, because Kirk had nothing left to push against, no chaos to hide behind, no confusion to twist into his favor, just facts and consequences. And as the judge began summarizing everything that had been presented, the outcome started to feel inevitable, like a slow-moving wave that everyone knew was about to crash, but no one could stop. Fans are shocked because they watched a story they thought they understood completely flip into something unrecognizable, a relationship they once rooted for now turning into a cautionary tale, and the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath as the final moments approached. Kirk's shoulders dropped slightly, his earlier defiance fading into something quieter, something heavier, like realization was finally setting in. This wasn't just a bad day, this wasn't just a temporary setback, this was the end of something he could never rebuild, not the same way, not after this. And Rasheeda stood there steady, unshaken, not celebrating, not smiling, just standing in her truth. After years of silence, after years of holding everything together while things quietly fell apart behind the scenes, and when the judge finally spoke, delivering the decision that would echo far beyond that room, the words landed like thunder, awarding Rasheeda full spousal support amounting to $300 million, the kind of number that doesn't just change lives, it resets them completely. Kirk didn't react immediately. He just stood there staring ahead, like he hadn't fully processed it yet, like his mind was still trying to catch up to what had just happened. But everyone else reacted, the gasps, the whispers, the stunned expressions, because this was more than anyone expected. Even those who supported Rasheeda didn't think it would go this far, and yet here it was, final, undeniable, irreversible. Emotions ran high as Kirk finally let out a breath that sounded almost like defeat, his head lowering slightly, his hands falling to his sides, because in that moment there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to fight. The battle was over and he had lost. And Rasheeda didn't move right away, she just closed her eyes for a brief second, like she was releasing years of tension, years of pain, years of holding on, and when she opened them again there was no hesitation. She turned and began to walk walk away, not looking back, not saying another word because she didn't need to. The outcome spoke louder than anything she could have said, and as she exited the courtroom the cameras outside erupted, capturing every step, every expression, every second of a moment that would be talked about for a long time to come. Fans are shocked. The headlines wrote, emotions ran high, the commentators repeated, the family was left divided, the insiders confirmed. But for Kirk Frost, standing there alone in that courtroom, none of those phrases mattered anymore, because all he could feel in that moment was the weight of everything he had lost. And just when it seemed like the story had reached its final chapter, just when everyone thought there was nothing left to uncover, one quiet voice from the back of the room broke the silence, saying, "This ain't over yet." And Kirk slowly lifted his head, because deep down he knew exactly what that meant. And that realization hit harder than the verdict itself, because just when Kirk thought the worst had already happened, just when he believed there was nothing left to lose, that voice echoed in his mind, "This ain't over yet." And suddenly the air in that courtroom felt heavier than before, like something unfinished was still hanging over him, waiting to drop at any moment. Kirk slowly turned his head, scanning the room, trying to figure out who said it, but no one stepped forward, no one claimed it, and that made it even worse, because now it felt like the threat was coming from everywhere at once. Fans are shocked, because what should have been the final moment of closure instantly twisted into something darker, something unresolved, and as reporters rushed outside chasing Rasheeda for comments, Kirk remained frozen for a few seconds longer, like his body refused to move, until his lawyer finally touched his shoulder, snapping him back to reality. "We need to go now," the lawyer said urgently, and Kirk nodded slowly, but even as he walked out his steps were heavier than ever before, like each one carried the weight of everything that had just collapsed behind him. Outside, the cameras immediately locked onto him, flashes going off, voices shouting questions. "Kirk, how do you respond to the ruling? Did you really hide assets? Are you going to appeal?" But Kirk didn't answer. He couldn't, because anything he said now would only dig him deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of. And across the steps Rasheeda stood, surrounded by her team, her expression calm but firm as she finally addressed the media. "I did what I had to do," she said simply, her voice steady. "After years of silence, I chose myself." And those words spread like wildfire, because they didn't just close a chapter, they ignited a whole new conversation. Fans are shocked, supporters flooded her with praise, calling her strong, calling her fearless, while others questioned the scale of the outcome, debating whether justice had been served or if things had gone too far. The family was left divided even more now, because there was no middle ground anymore. You were either with Rasheeda or you were standing with Kirk, and the tension didn't stay confined to the courthouse. It followed them home, into private spaces, into conversations that quickly turned into arguments. One insider revealed that later that night a heated confrontation broke out between close family members, voices raised, accusations flying, because everyone was trying to process what had just happened, but no one could agree on what it meant. Emotions ran high as one relative reportedly shouted, "He built all this from nothing, you can't just take it all." And another fired back, "She stood by him through everything, she earned that." And those clashes only proved how deep the divide had become. And meanwhile Kirk sat alone in a dimly lit room, staring at his phone, scrolling through headlines, comments, messages, all telling the same story in different ways, his name tied to words like downfall, collapse, exposure. And for the first time in a long time Kirk looked unsure, not angry, not defensive, just uncertain, like he was finally seeing himself through everyone else's eyes and not liking what he saw. But what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was the fact that this wasn't the end, because that voice, those words, "This ain't over yet," kept replaying in his head. And soon enough he found out why, because just hours after the verdict a new wave of rumors started surfacing, whispers of another situation, another layer to the story that hadn't been addressed yet. And this one didn't involve money, it involved loyalty, it involved trust on a completely different level. Fans are shocked as blogs and insiders began hinting that someone close to Kirk, someone he trusted, may have been feeding information to Rasheeda all along. And when that possibility reached him, it hit like a second collapse, because betrayal from a partner is one thing, but betrayal from someone in your inner circle, that cuts deeper than anything else. Kirk immediately started making calls, his tone sharp, demanding answers, but no one gave him anything solid, just vague responses, deflections, and that only made his suspicion grow. The family was left divided again, this time not just between Kirk and Rasheeda, but within Kirk's own circle, because now everyone was looking at each other, wondering who knew what, who said what, who played a role in how everything unfolded. And as tension built behind the scenes, Rasheeda remained quiet, not addressing the rumors, not confirming anything, just moving forward like she had already said everything she needed to say. And that silence spoke volumes, because it suggested one thing very clearly: she wasn't worried about what was coming next, and that made everyone else even more uneasy. Emotions ran high as Kirk finally confronted one of his closest associates late that night. "You been talking to her?" he demanded, his voice low but intense, and the response he got wasn't denial, it wasn't anger, it was hesitation. And that hesitation was all Kirk needed to see, because in that moment something inside him shifted again, this time not just breaking but hardening, because now this wasn't just about losing money or a relationship, this was about losing trust, losing control, losing the very foundation he thought he stood on. And as the night dragged on, the realization became impossible to ignore. ignore. Everything he thought was secure was gone. Everything he thought he could manage had slipped out of his hands, and now he was left standing in the aftermath trying to figure out what came next. But the truth was there was no clear answer because the story was still unfolding, the damage was still spreading, and the consequences were far from finished. Fans are shocked, the headlines continued, emotions ran high, the discussions repeated, the family was left divided, the insiders confirmed. But behind all those phrases, behind all the noise, there was one undeniable reality: Kirk Frost was no longer the one in control of his own story. And as the camera flashes faded and the public attention slowly shifted to the next big headline, one question remained hanging in the air, heavier than everything else: what happens when a man who loses everything decides he has nothing left to lose? What happens next isn't redemption, it isn't quiet reflection, it's something far more unpredictable, because when Kirk Frost walked out of that house the following morning, there was a different energy around him, something colder, something sharper, like a man who had finally accepted that the version of his life he once controlled was gone for good, and now all that remained was whatever he decided to do with the pieces left behind. Fans are shocked because instead of disappearing, instead of laying low, Kirk started moving differently, making calls, reconnecting with people he hadn't spoken to in months, even years, and insiders began whispering that this wasn't a man retreating, this was a man preparing. Emotions ran high as one source revealed he's not done, he's planning something, and those words spread fast because nobody knew exactly what that something was, but everyone felt it coming at the same time. Rasheeda continued forward with a calm confidence that only made Kirk's sudden shift feel even more intense. She was seen stepping into meetings, expanding her business presence, appearing unbothered publicly, while privately those close to her claimed she was finally at peace, like a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. The family was left divided, but now the division carried a different tone, less chaotic, more calculated, because both sides were no longer reacting, they were anticipating. And that's when the next twist hit without warning. Late one evening, a leak surfaced, not from Rasheeda's side, not from the courtroom, but from somewhere completely unexpected. A recording, a conversation, a voice that sounded unmistakably like Kirk, discussing plans not just about money but about how he intended to rebuild everything quietly, strategically, and without anyone seeing it coming. Fans are shocked as the audio spread like wildfire, people analyzing every word, every pause, every tone, because it didn't sound like defeat, it sounded like intent. "You think this over," he allegedly said in the clip. "Nah, this just round one," and those words changed the entire narrative again, because now this wasn't just a story about loss, it was a story about what comes after loss. Emotions ran high as reactions poured in, some calling it determination, others calling it delusion, but either way one thing became clear: Kirk Frost was not accepting the ending everyone else thought was final. And when reporters tried to confront him about the recording, he didn't deny it this time, he didn't deflect, instead he looked straight ahead and said, "Everybody got a comeback story, you just gotta wait for mine." And that single statement sent shockwaves through an already shaken audience, because now the tension wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what was about to happen next. Meanwhile, Rasheeda finally broke her silence on the situation during a quiet but pointed appearance where she addressed the rumors without naming Kirk directly. "Some people don't know when to let go," she said calmly, "but I've already moved on, and I suggest they do the same." But those words didn't calm the situation, they intensified it, because now it felt like two completely different paths heading toward an inevitable collision, one focused on closure, the other focused on comeback, and the family was left divided more than ever before, caught between those two directions, unsure which one would ultimately define what happens next. Insiders revealed that tensions behind the scenes continued to rise, with more secrets threatening to surface, more conversations being exposed, more alliances shifting quietly in the background, and every new development only added fuel to a situation that refused to settle. Fans are shocked because what started as a courtroom battle had evolved into something much bigger, something ongoing, something that felt less like an ending and more like the start of a long, unpredictable saga. Emotions ran high as speculation reached new levels, with theories about potential legal appeals, business rivalries, even personal revelations that had yet to come out. And through it all, one thing remained consistent: the uncertainty, because no one truly knew how far either side was willing to go or what lines were left to cross. And as the spotlight continued to follow every move, every statement, every silence, Kirk Frost stood at a crossroads, no longer the man he was before, but not yet whatever he was becoming, while Rasheeda stood firmly in her new reality, unshaken, unapologetic, and completely done looking back. And somewhere between those two paths, between the past that had collapsed and the future that had yet to fully reveal itself, the story continued building tension with every passing moment, leaving everyone watching wondering if this was truly the aftermath or just the calm before an even bigger storm. The tension didn't fade, it evolved, and what made it even more dangerous was how quiet everything suddenly became, because when chaos goes silent it usually means something bigger is forming underneath, and Kirk Frost knew it. Every move he made now felt calculated, like he was playing a long game that nobody else fully understood. Fans are shocked because instead of public outbursts or messy reactions, Kirk went strategic, disappearing from the spotlight just long enough to make people wonder what he was planning, and that curiosity only fueled the drama even more. Rumors started circulating about new business moves, secret meetings, and potential partnerships that could shift his entire narrative again. Emotions ran high as one insider revealed he's rebuilding from the ground up, but not the way people think, and that single statement sent speculation into overdrive because nobody could confirm what that meant, but everyone felt like something was coming. At the same time, Rasheeda continued to rise in her own lane, stepping into her new life with a level of control that made it clear she wasn't looking back, not even for a second. She expanded her brand, made appearances, and carried herself with a confidence that only comes from finally closing a painful chapter. The family was left divided, but now the division felt permanent, like lines had been drawn that would never be erased. Conversations that once held hope for reconciliation were now replaced with distant silence and unspoken resentment, and just when it seemed like both sides had settled into their separate realities, another twist hit without warning. A financial report leaked online detailing a series of rapid transactions tied to Kirk's name, and while it didn't directly contradict the court's ruling, it raised serious questions about how quickly he was able to reposition himself. Fans are shocked as people began dissecting the report, pointing out patterns suggesting that Kirk may have already been preparing for this outcome long before the verdict was ever announced. Emotions ran high as critics accused him of planning an exit strategy, while supporters argued that it was simply smart business. But regardless of the perspective, one thing became undeniable: Kirk Frost was not as broken as people initially believed, and that realization changed everything again, because now the story wasn't about a man who lost everything, it was about a man who might have seen it coming all along. Meanwhile, Rasheeda responded in her own way, not with direct confrontation but with subtle moves that spoke just as loudly. She secured new deals, expanded her influence, and made it clear through her actions that she was stepping into a new era, completely independent and fully in control, and that silent power move only added more tension because it showed she wasn't threatened, she wasn't concerned, she was done, and that kind of finality can be more unsettling than any argument. The family was left divided deeper than ever now because there was no longer a shared reality between the two sides. Kirk's circle began tightening, becoming more selective, more guarded, while Rasheeda's circle appeared stronger, more unified, more aligned with her vision. And as both sides moved further apart, the possibility of any kind of resolution faded completely. Fans are shocked because what started as a dramatic breakup had transformed into something much more complex, a battle of strategy, image, and long-term positioning. Emotions ran high as new whispers emerged, suggesting that more information could still surface, details that hadn't yet been revealed, stories that hadn't yet been told, and if that happened, it could reignite everything all over again. But for now, both Kirk and Rasheeda seemed to be playing a different kind of game, one that wasn't about immediate reactions but about who would ultimately control the narrative moving forward. And as the world watched closely, analyzing every move, every appearance, every silence, one thing became crystal clear: this story was far from over, because when two people who once built everything together end up standing on opposite sides with nothing left tying them together except history, the fallout doesn't just disappear, it lingers, it evolves, and sometimes it comes back even stronger than before, leaving everyone watching asking the same question: is this really the end or just another beginning? And just when people started convincing themselves that things had finally settled, that the storm had passed and both sides had moved on quietly, the situation took one final turn that nobody saw coming, because late one night a sudden announcement dropped online, not from blogs, not from insiders, but directly from Kirk Frost himself, and the message was short but powerful enough to shake everything. Again, he wrote, "Rebuilding from scratch," and within minutes fans are shocked. Reactions flooded in trying to decode what it meant. Was it business? Was it personal? Was it a warning or a promise? And what made it even more intense was the timing, because it came right after reports surfaced that Rasheeda had finalized multiple new ventures, securing her independence on a level that made it clear she wasn't just recovering, she was thriving. Emotions ran high as speculation exploded, some believing Kirk was preparing to launch something massive, others convinced it was his way of reclaiming control over a narrative that had slipped away from him. But regardless of interpretation, one thing became undeniable: neither of them was backing down from their new paths, and the family was left divided in a way that now felt permanent, not emotional chaos anymore, but a quiet separation where both sides existed without overlap, without communication, without any intention of coming back together. And behind the scenes, insiders revealed that conversations had completely stopped. No more attempts to fix things, no more negotiations, just distance and acceptance, and that silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Meanwhile, Kirk's next move finally started to take shape as rumors of a new project began to surface, something separate from everything he had built before, something that didn't rely on the past but instead focused on creating a completely new image. Fans are shocked because the same man who was once seen standing in defeat in that courtroom now appeared focused, driven, almost unrecognizable from the version people thought they understood. And Rasheeda responded in her own quiet way, continuing to elevate her brand, making appearances, and carrying herself with a level of calm that suggested she had already won in the ways that mattered most. And that contrast between them became the real story, not who lost and who won, but how differently they chose to move forward after everything collapsed. Emotions ran high as public opinion continued to shift, some now seeing Kirk's determination as resilience, while others remained firm in their support for Rasheeda, viewing her as the one who turned pain into power. And as both narratives grew stronger, the tension between them transformed into something less visible but just as intense, a silent competition of success, influence, and legacy. And just when it seemed like that would be the final form of this story, one last revelation quietly emerged, a confirmation that both Kirk and Rasheeda had been approached for separate opportunities to tell their sides of the story publicly in full detail, and that possibility instantly reignited everything, because if either of them chose to speak openly about what really happened behind closed doors, it could change the entire narrative. Again, fans are shocked because the idea of hearing the complete truth from either side brought back all the questions, all the speculation, all the curiosity that never fully disappeared. The family was left divided yet again, as some encouraged telling everything while others warned that reopening those wounds could cause even more damage. Emotions ran high as both sides remained silent on whether they would accept those offers, leaving everyone watching suspended in uncertainty, because at this point anything could happen. Another reveal, another twist, another shift in power, and as the story continues to linger in the public eye, refusing to fully fade, one thing remains clear: this was never just about money, it was about control, trust, betrayal. And what happens when all of those things collide at once? And now, as both Kirk Frost and Rasheeda move forward on completely separate paths, building new versions of their lives in real time, the world continues to watch closely, waiting for the next move, the next reveal, the next moment that could once again change everything. And until that moment comes, the question still hangs in the air, louder than ever before: who really walked away with everything, and who is still trying to prove they never lost at all? And just when it seemed like the story had stretched as far as it could go, like every secret had already been dragged into the light and every emotion had already been pushed to its limit, the silence broke one more time in a way nobody expected, because this time it didn't come from Kirk, it didn't come from Rasheeda, it came from someone who had stayed quiet through everything, someone who had watched from the sidelines, absorbing every detail and finally deciding to speak. And the moment that voice surfaced, everything shifted again. Fans are shocked because the statement didn't just add to the story, it reframed it completely, hinting that what the public had seen was only a fraction of what really happened behind closed doors. Emotions ran high as the revelation suggested that both sides had protected certain truths not out of fear but out of strategy, and that alone was enough to ignite a whole new wave of speculation, because if there were still layers hidden, then everything people thought they understood could change again. The family was left divided once more, not just between Kirk and Rasheeda but between what people believed was true and what might still be uncovered. And as whispers turned into discussions and discussions turned into full-blown debates, one thing became clear: this situation had moved beyond a simple fallout, it had become a narrative with multiple sides, multiple truths, and no clear ending. Kirk Frost continued moving in silence, building whatever it was he had planned with a level of focus that suggested he was no longer reacting to the past but preparing for the future, while Rasheeda stood firm in her own lane, unbothered on the surface but clearly aware that the story was still evolving and that anything revealed next could shift the balance. Once again, fans are shocked because instead of closure, what they were witnessing felt like an ongoing unraveling, a situation where every answer created more questions and every reveal opened the door to something deeper. Emotions ran high as new theories emerged, suggesting alliances that were never public, decisions that were made long before the courtroom, and moves that were calculated far earlier than anyone realized. And through it all, one thing remained consistent: the tension, because even without direct confrontation, even without public arguments, the energy between Kirk and Rasheeda lingered like something unfinished, something unresolved, something waiting for the right moment to rise again. The family was left divided in a way that now felt permanent, not because of anger but because of distance, because of everything that had been said, everything that had been exposed, and everything that had yet to be revealed. And as both sides continued forward, building separate futures that no longer intersected, the story refused to fully close, because every move, every decision, every silence carried the weight of everything that came before it. Fans are shocked because what started as a shocking courtroom victory turned into a long unfolding saga of power, control, and transformation. And as time passes and the headlines slowly begin to fade, one truth remains impossible to ignore: this was never just about who won or who lost, it was about what happens when two people who once shared everything are forced to redefine themselves completely without each other. And now, as Kirk Frost continues to rebuild, as Rasheeda continues to rise, and as the world continues to watch every move, waiting for the next chapter, the final question still lingers stronger than ever before: was this the end of their story, or just the beginning of something even bigger that nobody is ready for yet? And just when the noise began to fade into the background and people thought the story had finally reached its natural end, something shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt even more unsettling, because it was quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Kirk Frost reappeared, not with explanations, not with apologies, but with results, and that alone was enough to pull everyone back into the narrative. Fans are shocked because the same man who once stood in that courtroom looking completely defeated was now showing signs of a calculated return, not chasing attention but letting attention find him through subtle moves, strategic appearances, and and whispers of a project that seemed to be gaining traction faster than anyone expected. Emotions ran high as insiders began hinting that Kirk's rebuild wasn't just about recovering losses, it was about rewriting how he would be seen moving forward, creating something that stood separate from the past, something that didn't rely on the relationship that once defined him. And that idea alone sparked a new wave of reactions, because some saw it as growth while others saw it as an attempt to erase what had happened. Meanwhile, Rasheeda continued her rise, but now with a presence that felt even more solid, even more intentional, like someone who had fully stepped into her own narrative without needing validation from anyone else. She expanded her influence, made bold moves, and carried a quiet confidence that told the world she had already closed that chapter completely. The family was left divided, but no longer chaotic, just separated into two realities that no longer overlapped, one tied to what was lost, the other focused on what was gained. And as both sides continued forward, something unexpected began to happen. The conversation started to change. Fans are shocked because instead of focusing solely on the drama, people began comparing the outcomes, the paths, the decisions, and what they revealed about both Kirk and Rasheeda. Emotions ran high as debates shifted from who was right to who handled the aftermath better, who adapted, who evolved, who turned the situation into something more. And that shift in perspective added a new layer to the story, one that went beyond the initial fallout and into the long-term impact of everything that had unfolded. And just when it seemed like that would be the final transformation of the narrative, one last development surfaced quietly but powerfully, a joint opportunity, something neither Kirk nor Rasheeda had addressed publicly, but one that insiders claimed could bring them into the same space again, not as partners, not as a couple, but as two individuals confronting the same history from completely different angles. Fans are shocked because the idea of them crossing paths again, after everything that had happened, felt almost unreal. Emotions ran high as speculation exploded about what that interaction could look like. Would it be tense? Would it be civil? Would it reopen wounds or finally bring some form of closure? And the family was left divided once more on whether such a moment should even happen at all. But both Kirk and Rasheeda remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the possibility, leaving the world in a state of anticipation once again. Because if there is one thing this story has proven, it is that nothing stays quiet for long, and every time it seems like the final chapter has been written, something else emerges to remind everyone that the story is still alive, still evolving, still unfinished. And as Kirk Frost continues building his comeback, as Rasheeda continues strengthening her independence, and as the possibility of one final intersection lingers in the background, the question that refuses to fade becomes louder than ever before. Not who won, not who lost, but what happens when two people who walked away from the same story are forced to face it again one last time. And just when it felt like the story had stretched to its limit, like every possible twist had already unfolded and every emotion had already been exhausted, the silence broke one final time in a way that no one could have predicted, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, intentional, and that made it even more powerful. Kirk Frost finally stepped forward, not to defend, not to argue, but to speak, and when he did, the tone was different, calmer, measured, almost reflective, like a man who had spent enough time in the aftermath to understand what it all meant. Fans are shocked because this wasn't the Kirk they had seen before. This wasn't the man reacting under pressure. This was someone who had processed the loss, the exposure, the collapse, and turned it into something else entirely. Emotions ran high as he acknowledged the situation without going into details, without shifting blame, without reopening wounds, simply stating that sometimes you lose things you thought you would have forever, and sometimes losing them is the only way you learn who you really are. And those words hit differently because they didn't carry anger, they carried acceptance. And at the same time, Rasheeda continued to stand firm in her own space, her silence still speaking louder than anything else, her actions continuing to show that she had moved forward completely, without hesitation, without regret. The family was left divided, but no longer in conflict, just existing on separate sides of a story that had already changed them all in different ways. And as both Kirk and Rasheeda settled into their new realities, something unexpected happened. The intensity began to fade, not because the story was forgotten, but because it had finally reached a point where there was nothing left to prove. Fans are shocked because after everything, the arguments, the revelations, the tension, the outcome, the story didn't end with another explosion. It ended with distance, with growth, with two people choosing completely different paths and sticking to them. Emotions ran high as the final pieces of the narrative fell into place, not through dramatic reveals but through quiet consistency, through the way both sides continued to move forward without looking back. And in that quiet ending there was something more powerful than all the chaos that came before it. There was closure, not the kind that comes from winning or losing, but the kind that comes from letting go. And as the world slowly shifts its attention elsewhere, as new stories rise and old headlines fade, one truth remains clear: this wasn't just a moment, this was a transformation for both Kirk Frost and Rasheeda, a turning point that forced them to redefine themselves separately after years of being defined together. And even though the drama may have settled, the impact remains, because stories like this don't just disappear, they linger in the choices that follow, in the paths that are taken, and in the lives that are rebuilt from the ground up. And now, as everything finally comes to rest, the question that once echoed so loudly finds its answer, not in words, not in headlines, but in the quiet reality that follows when two people walk away from the same storm and choose to never return to it again. And even as that quiet closure settled and even as the world slowly moved on and the noise around their names began to fade into the background, there was still something lingering beneath the surface, something that refused to completely disappear, because stories like this don't just end, they echo, and those echoes started showing up in the smallest ways, in subtle interviews, in passing comments, in the way both Kirk Frost and Rasheeda carried themselves when their past was mentioned. Fans are shocked because even without direct confrontation, the tension never fully vanished. It simply transformed into something quieter, something internal, something that lived in the space between what was said and what was left unsaid. Emotions ran high as one interviewer carefully brought up the situation again, asking Kirk if he would change anything if he had the chance, and for a moment he paused, not defensively, not angrily, but thoughtfully, like someone weighing the past against the present before answering. You don't get to rewrite life, you just learn from it. And that response spread quickly, not because it reignited drama but because it added depth to a story that had already gone through so many layers. Meanwhile, Rasheeda in a separate moment was asked a similar question, and her answer was just as telling. I don't regret choosing peace. And that single statement resonated deeply because it confirmed what many had already begun to understand. This wasn't just about conflict anymore, this was about evolution. The family was left divided in history but no longer in motion, because both sides had fully committed to moving forward without reopening old wounds. And as time passed, the narrative itself began to shift in the public eye. What was once seen as explosive drama started to be viewed as a powerful turning point, as a moment where everything broke down only to be rebuilt in completely different ways. Fans are shocked because the same story that once fueled arguments and debates was now being discussed as a lesson about trust, about growth, about what happens when things fall apart in the most public way possible. Emotions ran high, not from conflict anymore but from reflection, from people looking back at every twist, every reveal, every decision, and realizing how much had changed since that first moment in the courtroom. And through it all, Kirk Frost continued building his new path, step by step, without rushing, without forcing attention, just allowing his actions to speak, while Rasheeda continued rising with confidence, clarity, and a sense of control that made it clear she had fully stepped into a new chapter of her life. And as both of them moved further away from the past, something unexpected happened. The distance between them stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like resolution, not because everything was fixed but because everything had been accepted. And in that acceptance there was a quiet strength, a kind of ending that doesn't need to be announced because it's already understood. And as the story finally settles into that space, as the drama transforms into memory and the memory transforms into perspective, one final realization remains: this was never just about money or betrayal or even the outcome. It was about two people reaching a point where they could no longer continue the same story and choosing instead to walk away and create something new on their own terms. And now, as the world looks back at everything that happened, from the chaos to the silence, from the breakdown to the rebuild, one question that once felt urgent now feels answered in the simplest way possible. Sometimes the biggest endings aren't loud, they're quiet, and sometimes walking away is the only way to truly win. And as that quiet truth settled deeper into the story, as the headlines faded and the noise that once surrounded every move, every word, every reaction slowly disappeared into the background, what remained wasn't chaos anymore, it wasn't conflict, it was something far more lasting, something that couldn't be erased by time or distraction, because what Kirk Frost and Rasheeda had gone through had already reshaped everything about who they were and how they would be seen going forward. Fans are shocked because the same situation that once felt explosive now felt reflective, like a mirror showing not just their story but something bigger, about relationships, about trust, about the consequences of choices made behind closed doors. Emotions ran high, not in the form of arguments but in the form of realization, as people began to look back and connect all the pieces, understanding how each moment led to the next, how each decision built toward that breaking point, and how that breaking point ultimately forced both of them into completely new versions of themselves. The family was left divided in history, but in the present there was a kind of stillness, a kind of acceptance that had replaced the tension, because there was nothing left to fight over, nothing left to prove, only paths to walk separately. And as Kirk continued forward, rebuilding not just his image but his sense of self, and as Rasheeda continued rising not just in success but in peace, the contrast between them became less about opposition and more about individuality. Two different journeys born from the same collapse. Fans are shocked because what once felt like a story about loss now felt like a story about transformation, about what happens after everything falls apart and you are left with no choice but to start again. Emotions ran high as those watching realized that the real impact of this situation wasn't the courtroom, wasn't the money, wasn't even the betrayal, it was what came after. It was how both of them chose to respond, how they chose to rebuild, how they chose to define themselves without each other. And that is what turned this from a moment into a lasting narrative, something that would be talked about not just for the drama but for the way it ended, not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with distance and growth. And as time continues to move forward, as new stories take the spotlight and this one slowly becomes part of the past, the essence of it remains, because stories like this don't just disappear, they leave behind lessons, they leave behind reflections, they leave behind a reminder that even the strongest foundations can break, and when they do, what matters most is not how they broke but how the people people involved choose to rebuild, and now as everything finally settles into that quiet space, where the past no longer controls the present and the future is no longer tied to what once was, the story reaches its true ending, not in a dramatic moment, not in a final confrontation, but in the simple undeniable reality that both Kirk Frost and Rasheeda moved on, and in doing so closed a chapter that once defined them forever. And even with that chapter finally closed, even with both Kirk Frost and Rasheeda fully stepping into separate lives that no longer intersect, the story leaves behind something that continues to resonate far beyond the drama itself, because what unfolded between them was never just about headlines or courtroom decisions. It became a reflection of what happens when trust erodes slowly behind the scenes and then collapses all at once in full public view. Fans are shocked because when they look back now, they don't just see the arguments or the accusations, they see the moments that led up to it, the overlooked signs, the quiet tensions, the choices that seemed small at the time but eventually built into something impossible to ignore. Emotions ran high, not in chaos anymore but in understanding, as people began to recognize how easily situations like this can grow without being addressed, and how devastating the consequences can be when they finally surface. The family was left divided in the past, but what remains now is distance that no longer feels hostile, just permanent, a separation that reflects everything that happened and everything that could not be undone. And as both Kirk and Rasheeda continue forward, their journeys become examples of two very different ways of handling the same storm, one focused on rebuilding from the ground up, learning from the fall and redefining identity, while the other focused on rising from the outcome, turning pain into strength and stepping fully into independence. Fans are shocked because the contrast between those paths highlights something deeper about resilience, about how there is no single way to recover from loss, no single way to move forward after everything changes. Emotions ran high as discussions shifted from judgment to perspective, from who was right or wrong to what could be learned from it all, and in that shift the story gained a different kind of weight, one that extended beyond entertainment and into reflection and growth. And as time continues to create more distance between what happened and what is happening now, the noise fades but the meaning remains, because moments like this don't just disappear, they become part of a larger conversation about relationships, about choices, about consequences, and about the strength it takes to walk away and start again. And now as Kirk Frost continues building his future and Rasheeda continues living hers with clarity and confidence, the final image of their story is not one of conflict but of separation. Two people who once stood side by side, now walking in completely different directions, carrying with them everything they learned, everything they lost, and everything they gained along the way. And in that quiet final image there is a kind of closure that doesn't need to be spoken, because it is already understood that sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of two completely different ones. And now, after everything you've just seen, after every twist, every reveal, every moment that left fans shocked and the family divided, one thing is clear: this story still has people talking, and you already know this isn't something everyone is going to agree on. Some are standing with Rasheeda, saying she finally took control and did what had to be done, while others are watching Kirk Frost closely, wondering if his comeback is about to flip the entire narrative again. So now it's your turn. What do you think? Did Rasheeda go too far, or did Kirk push things to a point where this outcome was inevitable? And more importantly, do you believe this story is really over, or is there still another shocking twist waiting to happen? Drop your opinion in the comments, because this conversation is far from finished. And if you want more stories like this, more drama, more behind the scenes chaos that nobody else is breaking down like this, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because if this situation has proven anything, it's that when it comes to stories like this, the real ending is never what it seems.